Well, hi, everybody. Most of you, I think, know me. I've talked a couple times to the Tuesday Fellowship group. You might note that I have an interesting holiday headdress here. That's courtesy of Barb and Dave Goodell. I came to Dave's because I don't find this Zoom um, thing to be exactly comfortable. I've done about 4 Zooms and each have had a small glitch, not enough to blow it out, but so it does help to have someone that can say, okay, we'll do this or that. And of course, Ted is there too. So, um, you know, uh,
So Ted, can you share with us? Or can we share?
well, we seem to be muted here. Okay. All right.
So if you want to advance, just go here.
Yeah.
Looks good.
Okay. How's that appearing to everybody?
Good.
Okay, perfect.
Great.
Okay. Well, let me begin here. I'm going to tell you that thanks to Dave, I actually have a correct slide title here for the talk that I'm going to do today. Um, in July of 2019, I was invited by the museum that's in my hometown of Greencastle, Pennsylvania, which is south of Chambersburg, to do a talk on a unionist editor of a newspaper there during the Civil War who was integrally important to both Lincoln and Pennsylvania in actions that he took, not only with the paper, but with other things, because he was in the legislature. So I thought we could convert this and make it a little bit of a hybrid talk. And I wanted to just comment a little bit in the 2020s here. The concept of political journalism, uh, has been very much in the forefront, whether that be in, the print area, whether that be on the cable or on the internet. But in fact, this concept of political journalism really began just prior to the Civil War. As we know, what was taking place was um, positions were beginning to consolidate in the United States. Um, this looming conflict was out there. Um, the the problem was that nobody wanted war, but I think probably realized that the issues were too strong to avoid it. So when Lincoln, um, ultimately became the candidate for president in 1860, and that's a very Pennsylvania plays an important role in that process, but I'm not going to spend time on that. During the preliminaries of um, um, that whole process, Lincoln is in Springfield, Illinois, and um, became a silent partner in one of the German speaking newspapers that had become established. Um, Lincoln was realizing at that point that not only was the press important, but capturing the attention of various ethnic groups, the Germans being one of the largest who came into the North, was a very important thing. And so nobody really knew that Lincoln had an ownership interest, but he would write small articles in this paper that the editor, who was German, would translate for the German audience. So um, uh, this is where Lincoln really got, um, the first roots of doing an interaction, uh, with people to make political points. So what he was doing is he was espousing positions that he supported, um, in this German-speaking newspaper. Um, and bit by bit, other papers were picking up, um, various politicians. We remember that Lincoln and Douglas had a famous series of debates. The transcripts of these, appeared in the press. So in this day and age, if you're going to be a journalist, of course you're going to college, and you have a journalism degree, and that sort of thing. Well, that wasn't the case, back in the late 1850s. Essentially, as long as you could express yourself in one way or another, you were pretty much had qualifications. In other words, you had to be sort of well spoken. Uh, you didn't have to have education for it. And so many of the journalists that we're going to encounter, did have unique ways of expressing themselves, and they can utilize that for um, the uh, positions that they wish to espouse. So I'm going to click on here. Um, these Dave, did for me, um, little blurbs of things from the New York Times. Um, this was um, in 1864 when McClellan was opposed Lincoln, in that campaign in the upper left there are things, political advertising materials. Um, and, there are blurbs from the New York Times. We will come back to, what was going on with the press in New York City in a little bit. So I'm going to page on here. Um, I'm just going to jump a little bit ahead here. Um, this man, none of you probably have ever heard of. Alexander McClure was a country boy, grew up, was born 1822 in Juniata County, which is just kind of north and a little bit west of Harrisburg, um, to farming parents. Uh, McClure hated farming. So his father apprenticed him to um, a leather maker, and he hated that more. But the third time was the charm, and McClure was apprenticed uh, to a newspaper in Juniata itself, and he caught uh, the press bug, in that uh, area. McClure at that time uh, had become interested in politics. Um, so his newspaper uh, roots were in Juniata County. But by 1832, McClure had moved to Franklin County, where Chambersburg is the county seat, and he had bought a partial interest in the Franklin Repository, which was the main newspaper in Chambersburg at that time. There was another paper called the Valley Spirit um, there, and there was a single um, issue weekly that also came out. So there were, three things. But the Franklin Repository, with McClure writing a lot of content, um, was um, becoming an important um, uh, factor uh, in political journalism. Um, what happened at this time? McClure had, when he got to Franklin County, he was um, uh, elected to the legislature, first to the House and then to the Pennsylvania Senate, where at that point he became very good friends with Andrew Curtin, who was the wartime governor of the state of Pennsylvania. Now, what happened was uh, McClure eventually became the chairman of the Military Affairs Committee in the Senate. And that was a very important role for him because, you know, after Lincoln was uh, elected, um, McClure worked furiously with Andrew Curtin and others to um, garner the militia manpower to meet Lincoln's original call for 75,000 troops. Um, this picture of McClure was about what he looked like when he started his political career. Um, these next pictures, the one to the left would be kind of a midterm picture of McClure. Um, and then the one at the right, very interesting picture. It was how he looked when he had a newspaper in Philadelphia, and he would have looked about like this when he died around 1909 in Wallingford. Um, I will talk a little bit more about that. Um, this picture of McClure in sort of midlife, um, had what his signature looked like. It was kind of a nice feature that Dave actually found for me. Now, one thing that um, um, happened back in these times, um, it, it occurs to me that people, especially if they had any newspaper experience, they were also quite opinionated on almost any topic. So um, we have two somewhat amusing ones that are attributed to McClure. Um, Obviously, this related to someone that he didn't care for very much, would be highlighted in this particular quote here. Um, Here is another one, um, and you can see that he does have an absolute way with words. Um, he does know how to put the knife in and turn it, as they say. So um, the next one, um, I believe, is one of the best quotes about Lincoln that anyone who interacted with him, um, brought forth. Uh, we'll see if we can make this, available off of the slide so that you can keep this. It is a little bit long, and you might say, well, how did McClure get to have this analysis? He had many, many visits with Lincoln during the war. There was sort of an open door policy that Lincoln had with numerous people, McClure being one of them. Andrew Curtin, the governor of Pennsylvania, was also one of those. And I have some slides about that. So rather than break down this quote on Lincoln's character, we'll move on here and see if we can't provide this, to the Tuesday Fellowship group, particularly if you like Lincoln. Um, this is a really good one. And there's no cutting remarks about Lincoln, as there were about the people in the first two quotes. So there is Andrew Curtin, kind of a young looking guy. And um, Curtin was um, pretty much of a political marvel. There were people like Simon Cameron, who ultimately became Lincoln's first Secretary of War, that thought they should be president, and it was through the actions of Curtin, especially, and Alexander McClure also, that Lincoln really was able to get into office. I think he was an exceptional governor, would have been for any time. But Curtin is not our subject for today, so we will move on. There's what Cameron looked like. Uh, People that have studied Cameron, wondered, how someone that thought graft was, just one of the parts that you could benefit of the political process. He fortunately did not make an issue of trying to run for president. Um, uh, because he was pretty much a total failure as Secretary of War. He was replaced by Edwin Stanton, who by most accounts was a pretty solid Secretary of War. Okay, this is the first of the big three editors in New York City. Horace Greeley was the um, uh, owner, editor, and publisher of the New York Tribune. The Tribune was a mostly unionist newspaper. But anybody who knows a little bit about Horace Greeley was that he somewhat blew hot and cold. He was very pro-unionist in the beginning of the war, used the paper, to support Lincoln, to support the actions that were happening during the war. Um, but as the war drug on, he sort of got cold feet more. He was not as supportive, um, began to be more critical of Lincoln and, the generals also. Um, I'll have some more to say about Greeley because I want to comment um, uh, in a little bit after I go through the other two people in New York. Henry Raymond was completely unionist from the beginning of the war to the end. Um, Lincoln, um, I don't think used Raymond um, to the degree that he could. Um, they had a good relationship, but Raymond could have done more for Lincoln um, to help with sort of the psychological support of the war effort. And for some reason, Lincoln didn't do that. But he was reliable and pretty true blue. Um, I will talk a little bit more about Raymond in a bit. This man, James Gordon Bennett, um, was the owner, editor, and publisher of the New York Herald. He was completely anti-Nixon, anti-Lincoln, um, and um, the only time that he produced something favorable to Lincoln was after Lincoln's assassination. And it was actually considered one of the strongest assessments of Lincoln as a person. Why Bennett couldn't have seen this at an earlier time, I don't know, but be that as it may. Um, it's important to know that competition was very keen um, for um, customers, in New York. These all three were pretty good sized papers for their time. And, you know, there was a lot of not only rivalry, but bickering between the three of them. Um, you know, um, uh, it what really began to expand the spread of the print press were really two things. First, the railroads and their expansion, but then the main one was the development and spread of the telegraph. The telegraph of the two was probably, um, saw the greatest expansion. And all of these big papers in New York, which certainly had more money than small town uh, um, newspapers, you know, were utilizing the uh, the telegraph to get stories from battlefields and things, of that nature. So um, there is a very good book by a historian, one of the top Lincoln scholars, called Harold Holzer. That is his name. It's called Lincoln and the Power of the Press. Um, this book, um, if you were able to get it from the library, is a very good read. I don't believe there's any better treatment on the big three in New York City than what Harold Holzer uh, does. He captures, uh, the importance of what was going on in New York City, as well as Holzer really coins this term political journalism. Um, and he covers smaller papers too, but the one that I'm going to principally cover, is the one in Chambersburg. I can't do them all, so you know, um, yeah, I can show you here. We'll see if this comes up. Um, you can see the book here, Lincoln uh, and the Power of the Press. Uh, all right. Alexander McClure and um, Henry Raymond and Horace Greeley and others weren't the only press people that were able to come and visit Lincoln at the White House. This man, Noah Brooks, was a reporter for a newspaper in Sacramento, California, and he, after the war, would write what's considered a good um, history of Lincoln's war years. Um, he was always very pro Lincoln. He didn't sort of shift around, in the winds. Um, he's an interesting individual. McClure and Brooks did know each other, but beyond that, there was no cooperative work that was done because McClure was in Pennsylvania and Brooks, of course, his primary audience was in California. Um, just going to pass over some of this. Um, this is the bannerhead of the Spirit Times, the other newspaper in Chambersburg, very anti-unionist. Um, Interestingly enough, although Pennsylvania went for Lincoln in 1860, Franklin County did not. That was attributed somewhat because that county is right at the Maryland border, and there were developing feelings, about the support. The Lincoln only lost, however, by less than a dozen votes, in Franklin County. But the Spirit Times and the Franklin Repository, engaged in virtually daily combat, in their newspapers, not only against each other, but against things regarding the war. Uh, of course, you can't read anything from here. The print is too tiny, but I just wanted to show you what the caption head looked like. There's what the Franklin Repository caption head looked like. Um, it one reason that I think that it became the predominant paper was Alexander McClure was doing more things with the paper. Now, what I mean by that is there were other businesses that they were running. They were publishing books. They were doing regular printing for people. And this building that you can see here that says the repository building is where the newspaper offices are. When when I began my work life, that was as an attorney in Chambersburg in the year 1977. This was owned by one of the banks uh, in Chambersburg. But, um, you know, Alexander McClure saw that you had to really do more than one thing. Trying to make a living off of just running a newspaper was a little tough to do. This is what McClure's house looked like. Uh, this is actually the rebuild of his house because in 1864, the Confederates came to Chambersburg and attempted to ransom the town, gave about 20 minutes to come up with money, which was, of course, impossible. And so they burned the town. That um, um, repository building that I showed you, and this were one of the first things burned because the Confederates knew that McClure, um, had been writing very negative things about the Confederacy. Um, Chambersburg was rebuilt uh, first by um, the state action, and then it became one of the first federal relief projects in U.S. history, the rebuilding. So basically, what happened was the federal government reimbursed the state of Pennsylvania for rebuilding the town because it was pretty much completely burned down. But McClure lived in a nice house. I think it can be said. Interestingly enough, um, this house was called Norland at Wilson College, which still exists in Chambersburg. Bought this um, as one of the buildings for its campus. I mentioned that um, Lincoln uh, would allow editors that were very favorable, like McClure, Noah Brooks, and Greeley, Henry Raymond, to come. John Nicollet was one of Lincoln's secretaries. He never liked it when any of these people would come to visit. He felt it kept Lincoln away from work that he needed to do. But Nicollet had kind of a prickly personality, and generally did not get along well with any of these visitors. Um, he was a capable individual, but his personality did need some improvement. Um, Here is a man that we know from the Civil War, uh, you know, uh, probably the best general that the North produced. And he would ultimately go on to become president of the United States later. During the war, Alexander McClure and most of the press in the North supported Grant, in the campaigns and that type of thing. Of course, Bennett, the one anti-New York publisher, did not. Uh, um, Grant, um, when he ran the second time, by that time, it somewhat felt both McClure and Horace Greeley had gone a little bit off the wagon, so to speak. They both opposed Grant's running for a second term, and um, McClure supported Greeley at that time, who ran against Grant. Well, that that didn't go very far, and so um, it is just an interesting thing. So mainly, McClure was pretty reliable, in his support. Once he took a position on something, he would pretty much stick to it. But, you know, um, this was a rather strange turn of events. Now, I mentioned a little bit about the repository building that McClure was um, doing some other things. He also had a law background. He didn't make any great shakes as an attorney. Uh, he was a politician, um, especially in the Senate and so forth. And after the war, he became a writer of books. This particular book, The 3,000 Miles Through the Rocky Mountains, actually became for um, people that were heading west to become miners in the Rocky Mountain area in Colorado, in Wyoming, these other states. Um, McClure went on an almost 1 year trip out through that area, you know, produced extensive maps of how to kind of come from the east, you know, uh, and go into these areas. Uh, it it really was considered a very important work, um, and by this time, McClure had, because the Confederates burned the paper in Chambersburg, he elected to sell the Franklin Repository, did surprisingly well on it for that time. Uh, Moved to Philadelphia, and among other things, he began writing various books. Um, this was probably his most famous and the most used book, the one related to the Rocky Mountains. This is considered um, a important book because when McClure would visit uh, Lincoln, um, he would get Lincoln's assessment of various generals on both sides of the conflict. And this book, written by McClure, was a product, of mainly those Lincoln visits. Um, McClure had a great respect for Andrew Curtin. He really thought he was a genius. And so, as a somewhat of a tribute to Curtin, um, he published this. It was uh, really as a result of a series of addresses that he had given in the Pennsylvania legislature about Andrew Curtin. But there was no prohibition against making a little money, so um, McClure, had these speeches published. This, everyone knows that Lincoln, used yarns and stories to illustrate points, not unlike Jesus did with parables. People could understand things oftentimes by the use, of storytelling. You know, uh, Lincoln loved to tell yarns and stories, and McClure was very adept at recording different ones that he had. You know, he did this book on Abe Lincoln's yarns and stories, and called him at that time, uh, America's greatest storytelling president. Okay, as I indicated, after the Civil War, uh, McClure sold that newspaper and bought um, another small paper called the Philadelphia Times. This one has an interesting masthead, which in the middle has the Great Seal of the Commonwealth, has commerce on the rivers, has factories. You see the smokestacks and so forth that illustrate, uh, you know, Philadelphia sort of being a town of commerce. Although he had great success with the Franklin Repository in Chambersburg, he did not have much success. He had difficulty getting readership, uh, in this area. But interestingly enough, he got himself elected to the legislature again, first to the House, then to the Senate. And he sold this newspaper and um, um, bought a small farm out in Wallingford, which I believe is in Delaware County. And that's where he lived. He left Philadelphia. He was, of course, living in Philadelphia, during the time that he owned and published the Philadelphia Times. Um, McClure's legislature time was very important to Pennsylvania. McClure, Pennsylvania was named for him and was named in his honor because McClure used his influence when he was in the legislature to get the railroad to come to that part of Pennsylvania. Of course, both logging and coal mining were going on, and it made a difference for that reason. So um, this is a picture of the U.S. Post Office there in McClure to show that it does still exist. There's a Philadelphia connection. You may have remembered before the pandemic closed so much down, this school became famous for uh, asbestos. And whether it had been properly remediated or not. Um, McClure um, was, again, as a result of his time in the legislature, had caused monies to uh, move in the direction of the Philadelphia school system. And they named an elementary school after him. This is in North Philadelphia, above where the Temple University main campus would be there on Broad Street. Um, so an interesting, interesting point. Dave had a map or two here. Um, I will happily take any questions either about what I said or anything else that's on your mind, whether I talked about it or not. So I guess um, we have to unmute.
If anyone has a question, unmute yourself.
How did McClure make his money?
Well, McClure made his money out of a variety uh, of things. The least money he made was as an attorney. But interestingly enough, uh, it sort of saved him at the end. McClure was pretty wealthy, but as many of you that follow any history know, there were uh, always panics in the early days in the monetary system. And McClure, strangely enough, was invested in the stock market to a pretty major degree. Well, when one of these panics went through, he lost pretty much everything he had other than his farm in Wallingford. But he got an appointment um, to the being clerk of the Pennsylvania Supreme Court in Philadelphia, and that's essentially how he finished his days. But to go back and answer him, the most money he made probably was a combination uh, of these books that I showed you just a few. Um, he probably published 21 books um, and did well with pretty much all of them. Um, he um, he did well in the newspaper business in Chambersburg. Surprisingly enough, because he somewhat diversified, didn't just print the paper. He was printing and all of that sort of thing. He um, he accumulated money, and you know, being in the legislature, while not large money, would have added to, uh, what he had, at that time. So it also illustrates, I might say, that a man in the 19th century, really in the 18th century too, um, often could not make a living doing just one thing. You had to almost have to have multiple things going on, uh, make money because things could suddenly become unlucrative. And if you put all of your eggs in one basket, well, it wasn't maybe such a wise point. McClure seemed to understand this, and although his end was a little more touch and go. Um, he he, uh, he understood the diversification of work principle. Anybody else with questions?
Jay, and you really didn't go into this, but I wish you'd comment on how the Lincoln administration cracked down on free press, the opposition press. There was a case right in Westchester where the opposition newspaper, the Chester County Times, um, was ransacked by the local mob, and then the U.S. Marshal came in and arrested the editor for a number of days. And it's my understanding that the Lincoln administration uh, carried out these kind of violations of the First Amendment all over the country.
Yeah, they were not extremely widespread. Uh, uh, Dave Walter's right that they were selective. There was this one there. When I first gave this talk, of course, they weren't really utilizing anything related to martial law. But what they apparently were using was that the writ of habeas corpus, I guess, had been suspended. And under some kind of a convoluted logic, you know, they would use this temporary shutdown process, such as Dan briefly talked about in Westchester, to get people's attention. You know, there was another one, I believe, uh, around State College, and it was just for a couple days. The unionist editor was arrested. The offices were closed down, and then they were allowed to ultimately reopen. Even in Lincoln State of Illinois, this was the type of thing. I am not as aware in other parts of the country, but you know, uh, obviously, um, in this day and age, something like this is not only controversial but illegal. uh, so, um, but um, yeah, it was sort of the downside um, of the press um, action. Not everybody was favorable to what was going on, and um, it was. Uh, I think it was fortunate that it was not widespread, and where it was used, it was for a brief duration. Um, if they had been proactively doing this right and left with, dissident press in the North, uh, that could have had, I think, very negative repercussions. They slipped by with it, but um, you know, uh, it certainly wasn't, you know, uh, uh, a great thing that went on. You know, anybody else that have questions, um, about the thing? Hopefully, you didn't feel like you had too much Alexander McClure and not enough of Lincoln. Um, I might say in conclusion that I believe Lincoln, he was perceptive in many areas, but in this area of utilizing, to the press to support, um, his position, you know, he, um, was above average. For really a good full treatment, on this subject, I can't recommend too highly, this Harold Halser book on Lincoln and the press. Particularly, he's very strong. Of course, he's from New York. Um, so it's not surprising that he's very interested in the three big editors, but he does a good job on some of the other editors. Interestingly enough, the man that I focused on somewhat as a small town editor, McClure, um, he does not give treatment. He does, talk about some others in other states, especially in Illinois, for example. So, it's, a very good read. Anybody that knows about Lincoln is going to know who Harold Holzer is. Um, so, That's about it. I don't know what time it is. I don't have my watch here.
Five of.
Well, good.
Thank you, Jay.
So I hope that you maybe learned a little something. I guess all speakers hope that audiences come away with a little something that they didn't maybe know before the talk, took place.
Any other questions for Jay from the group? Dave Walter, what's up next week?
I believe John Frost is going to speak on a topic that he hasn't announced to us yet.
Oh, okay. Surprise.
And then there's one more after that. John Hurt's going to speak on the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918.
Well, that's a very good anchor leg person, in my opinion.